Good morning. So as we requested before we started the recording, that today's class be dedicated to the safety and security of our brethren in Israel.
Amen.
And at the highest level, that's Mashiach's coming, maybe without delay.
Amen.
So we're on top of Kuf Amud Beis 100b. So we introduced a new idea. So we have a number of ideas that we're going to have to wait a couple of pages till we get to the Shulchan Aruch. So let's try to keep track of all the ideas we have to cover. Idea number one is not to start eating after the 9th hour before Pesach, on Pesach afternoon, the night of Pesach, not to start eating after the 9th hour. That was idea number one we have to keep track of, which we'll get back to on page 107 of Zion. The second idea we have is that once you start eating, or if you started eating before the 9th hour and you continued going on Pesach night, certainly you have to stop your meal at nightfall on Pesach night. That's also going to come later. And the third idea, which was introduced yesterday, which is on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and that's going to be the bulk of the discussion of the next 5 or 6 pages, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, if you began your meal when you were allowed to in the afternoon, and the meal continued all the way through Shabbos begins, Kiddush Yom, the day becomes holy upon him, sunset. So Poyres Mappa, he takes a cloth, covers the bread, Makadosh makes Kiddush, and then continues his meal. So that, along with the rest of the laws of Kiddush, are going to be unpacked over the next 5 or so pages. And that's going to be in Simin Reish Ayin Aleph, in the Shulchan Aruch, chapter 271, I believe, or 72, so I think it's 71, Reish Ayin Aleph, where all of these halachas are to be found, and we're going to go through the Gemoro and then unpack all that. In the middle, we're going to have another set of halachas, which is another Simin in Shulchan Aruch, which is the custom to make Kiddush in Shul Friday night. That's Simin Reish Samach Tes, chapter 269. That's going to come up next week. That we will learn from the Shulchan Aruch right away because it's its own set of laws. And then we'll get back to the Kiddush discussion, which will be in 271, which will come once we get to Kuvav. So we got some ways till we get this whole picture. Okay, so yesterday, I guess we were introduced to this third idea of Poyres Mapo Makadosh. In the regular Shabbos and Yom Tov, person's eating his meal, and Kiddush of Lavayoim, the day becomes holy, becomes Shabbos or Yom Tov, middle of his meal. He covers the bread with a cloth, and makes Kiddush. And the Gemara said the same thing is true of Havdalah. That's what we were introduced to yesterday. So the Gemara now is going to cite 2 examples to substantiate this idea. The Gemara is going to get to that custom of making Kiddush in Shul, and then back to this, which is going to be a tangentially related conversation, and then we'll get back to the laws of covering the bread, making Kiddush, and then Kiddush in general. Okay, so top of the page, second line. Rabba bar Rav Huna, Rabba son of Rav Huna, iklo lebei reish galusa. He went to the house of the exilarch. Right, the exilarch is the head office. The head office of the Jewish people in Bavel, right? Part of that line that we discussed started from Hillel the Elder, Rabbi Nasi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Nasi, and then down to the exilarch, the Reish Galusa in Babylonia. Lasted for a very long time, this office.
Nasi?
Yes, it is. It's the Nasi, but not in Israel.
Not in Israel.
This is called Reish Galusa, the head of the exilarch. Aisu taka kame, they brought a plate before him. Now Rashi tells us, and this is, I think, actually significant. Rashi says when he got there, they were already at the meal on Erev Shabbos. That's how Rashi describes it. And I think this is relevant because maybe they shouldn't have brought a meal in front of him, but only because they were already eating. That's why they brought one, perhaps. Right? Because it says here that they brought a plate in front of him. Why would they bring a plate? It's right before Shabbos.
They were already.
So Rashi says, well, Shabbos. They were when he got there, they were already at this Erev Shabbos meal. And then he joined them. That's what it seems like from Rashi. Anyway, so he has a plate in front of him, and Shabbos sets. So Paras Mappa, he or they covered their bread with a cloth, the Kiddush, and they made Kiddush. So now we see, I mentioned this the other day, that Ma'aser Rav always takes precedent. You have sometimes texts that discuss the theory of the law, and then you have incidences where the law was actually implemented. And whenever you have an incident where the law itself is implemented, that gives us the confidence to say, yes, indeed, this theoretical text is the law. But sometimes if you find one text that says the law is X, you might find another text that says the other way. But when you have a story of sages, especially at the Exilarch, that behaved a certain way, you know that this is definitely the law. So here, that's what the Gemara cites to the story, where Rabbi, son of Rav Huna, was there, and they covered the bread, and they made Kiddush, as opposed to following Rabbi Yossi, which said, just continue your meal, no problem, or Rabbi Yehuda, which said, stop your meal. So we see, in actuality, the practice was to cover bread and make Kiddush, and then continue the meal after. Yeah.
What are these stories called? Is there a name?
Ma'aser Rav.
Ma'aser Rav.
Ma'aser means like story, Rav of a teacher, the rabbi. That's right. The actions of the rabbi. Ma'aser means like actions or story. The actions of the rabbi speak louder than the words. So Yiddish incorporated the word Ma'aser, but if you want to pronounce it in Hebrew, it would be Ma'aser. Right, but Ma'aser became like the Yiddish pronunciation for a story. But Ma'aser is an action. Mem ayin sin hey. Okay, and then the Gemara continues, and we indeed have a Mishnaic text which says the same thing. Now, both Rashi and Asban tell us to skip the word in the parentheses, which we're going to do, and to skip the shin of the next word and begin with the words ein. The text reads as follows, the Mishnaic text that backs up this practice. Ein mevin es hashulchan. The table, the food, should not be brought. Okay, Rashban gives us a whole backstory. We're going to leave that alone. You don't bring the table in front of the people, Ellen came Kiddush, unless they made Kiddush first. Right? Again, back in the old day, the table itself,
like little TV trays.
That's right, were brought to them with the food on it, not table. Anyway, this seems to be there's different ways of understanding this Mishnah. It says like this. Okay, what is this text talking about? Before Shabbos or on Shabbos? Let's just read the whole thing. Let's read this translate directly. One does not bring the table. Ellen came Kiddush unless the person made Kiddush first, then bring the table. Vim heavy, and if they did bring the table, Paris Mappa, you cover it with a cloth and Makadish and you make Kiddush. Does it describe them eating yet? Sorry? Doesn't describe them eating yet?
No.
So when
prior to.
So when is this?
Not clear, right?
Presumably, this is at night, after you come home from shul. And the Mishnah is saying, the table shouldn't be brought to you unless you make Kiddush first, then bring the food. But if they did bring the food, cover it with a cloth, which is what we have. We have a set table with challah on it, we have covered with a cloth, and we make Kiddush. It doesn't describe anything about eating. But what does it tell you? It teaches you that the bread has to be covered while you're making Kiddush. So in your middle of your meal, and therefore, if you're in the middle of your meal before Yom Tov, as per Rabbi Yossi, which says you're allowed to have a meal before Shabbos, okay, not Yom Tov, Shabbos, or Yom Tov, then when you make Kiddush at the time, you have to cover your cloth, as per this instruction, which says, don't bring the table. If you brought the table, cover it with a cloth.
So that Mishnah is not to teach about what Ma'aser Rav is teaching about.
Which is why the Ma'aser Rav is much more powerful. Which is why Rashi says they were already eating when he got there.
It's more.
That's right.
On point.
It's more on point. That's right. That's why the Ma'aser Rav. That's right.
The Mishnah, which is only discussing that you have to cover.
That's right. The Ma'aser Rav was much more powerful. Which is why Rashi tells us that they were already eating when he got there before Shabbos, and the meal set and the Shabbos set while they were eating, which really demonstrates at this point. This brisa only teaches you that when you make Kiddush in the presence of food, you got to cover the bread, which is what we do. And even Tosfos addresses this question because the Gemara elsewhere says that a person should come and have his table set when he gets home. So why is this Mishnah saying don't bring the table unless you make Kiddush first and then bring the table? But if you brought it, cover the bread. The Gemara elsewhere says that their table should be set when you come home from shul. Yeah, so he deals with that question.
That's enough to embarrass.
And he says that they used to they had it set somewhere else and they brought it to him afterwards. Yeah. But the point here is, it's clear from the way Tosfos is learning, even there's a long Rashbam, but it's clear certainly from Tosfos learning that the Mishnah here is not describing making what you ate before. It's just talking about in general when you come home from shul. So that in that case, the Mishnah only really teaches us that while you make Kiddush in the presence of bread, you have to cover the bread. But the Ma'aser Rav really tells you that if you're in the middle of a meal, you cover and make Kiddush in the middle. And that's perhaps why the Ma'aser Rav comes first. Even though the Ma'aser Rav is from the post-Mishnaic age, from Babylonia, whereas this text comes from Jerusalem. Because this text doesn't really back up what we're trying to say. It just makes the point that if you're making Kiddush in front of food, you have to cover the bread. Okay. Anyway, there's a long Rashbam here, which I'm kind of ignoring because he goes through a whole bunch of different explanations as to how to understand these stories and what happened. We're just sticking with Rashi and a little bit of Tosfos here, not to overcomplicate the story. Even though Tosfos himself learns that when, not like Rashi, he says that when Rabbi came to the meal, it was actually at the beginning of the meal, not in the middle. He came at the beginning of the meal.
So it could have been at the ninth.
So it could have been at the ninth. It's not quite clear. I'm just saying, I'm just opening the window to lots of complex details as to how this goes around, right? So just we're going to get, by the way, we'll get much more clarity when we get to the Shulchan Aruch. We're going to see a lot of these views be laid out more organized and then the halachic ruling. I'm just demonstrating to you how one Gemara can be seen in so many different ways. Like what exactly happened when he came to the Bavel? Did he come at the beginning of the meal? Did they come in the middle of the meal? When did they serve him that meal? Was it the beginning? Was it the Gemara doesn't say at which point in the meal.
Was it in the ninth hour?
Well, no, yes, exactly. And another thing, for example, it says here, he came to the Rosh Kalusa, they gave him a plate, he covered it and made Kiddush. Maybe that was after Shul. He came after Shul, they gave him a plate, he covered it, and made Kiddush, just like the Brisa says. That's right. Who said it was in the middle of the meal at all? Rashi says when he got there, they were already eating and the sun set. And presumably Rashi's learning that way because that would lead directly to the discussion right before, which was the halfway between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Otherwise, why is this story coming here? Right? But then what's the point of the Brisa? Because the Brisa doesn't describe anybody eating.
He covered it because he has to cover it as per the Brisa.
Exactly.
But they're covering theirs as per the Ma'aser Rav.
Okay, but that's not in the story, though.
They're not part of the
story. But that's not in the story.
No.
That's only in the story if you learn like Rashi where they're already eating.
Right? You see eating two different meals. Like they're not.
Exactly.
Would they be able? Well, this is a side point.
Yeah.
They're eating. They're not joined together. They had different intentions, right?
Well, first of all, the Gemara doesn't even say that the others were eating. It just says he came to the house of the exilarch. They gave him a plate. He covered it and he made Kiddush. Okay. That's all the story says. But what was the setting? Who else was eating there? Okay. Was anybody else eating there?
Right.
None of that is clear in the actual text of the Gemara. Right? So Tosfos and Rashbam learn it's after Kiddush. They gave him a plate. He covered it, made Kiddush. As per Brisa, that you cover the bread when you're making Kiddush. Doesn't really teach us the law we learned yesterday. Whereas Rashi says, no, they were middle of the meal. And he joined them, presumably. And it became nightfall middle. They covered the bread and made Kiddush, which is exactly what we learned yesterday. But Rashi does not comment at all on the Brisa. What's the Brisa teaching you? I'm filling in the blanks and telling you that the Brisa is teaching that while you make Kiddush in the presence of bread, you have to cover it. That's not clear in Rashi either. And Rashbam even gives a third alternative explanation. I'm just making the point that you see how one Gemara can spin off in a whole bunch of different understandings, which would lead to very different practical conclusions.
So it's conceivable that he had already davened Myra synagogue.
That's correct.
Coming to join them, but
that's right. It seems that's the way Tosfos and Rashbam would learn. Yep. So which would mean, in that perspective, this whole Gemara is a tangent. Because we mentioned this idea of covering bread, we're going to demonstrate that in general, you have to cover bread when you're making Kiddush in the presence of bread. From a Ma'aser Rav and from a Brisa. Whereas Rashi said, no, this is actually a continuation from the other story. It was the same exact story. Where he came and it was before Shabbos and they were eating and it became Shabbos in the middle of the meal.
So Rashi adds they were eating.
That's correct. Rashi adds that when he arrived, they were already at the thing, Be'erev Shabbos. Rashi adds that part of the story to make it connect to yesterday's Gemara.
Right. To make it connect.
But it's not in the actual Gemara itself.
You could pick it apart.
Correct.
Say the opposite.
Correct.
They weren't eating.
Correct.
You have to cover the bread.
While you're making Kiddush in the presence of bread, that's correct. That's correct. So I'm just demonstrating this point. Okay. few more lines. Gemoro says, Tani Chada, we learned in one brisa on the subject of the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. And we said there are two disputes. One dispute as to whether you're allowed to begin your meal after the ninth hour, dispute one. And dispute two is, do you have to stop at nightfall? And we already concluded that on Eda Pesach, we follow Rabbi Yehuda. You should not be eating after the ninth hour. And if you began your meal before the ninth hour, you have to stop as soon as nightfall comes. And on a regular Shabbos and Yom Tov, we follow Rabbi Yossi, that you may eat Friday afternoon, and you don't have to stop your meal, but you have to cover the bread and make Kiddush at nightfall. That's how we concluded. But now we're backing up and going to the Mishnaic era and introducing two more texts on the discussion of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Text one. Shavin, they both agree, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, she'ein maschilin, that one doesn't begin eating. End quote. Right? This is a little strange. I hope you're realizing.
Yeah.
The Tani Idach, and we have another Mishnaic text which reads, quote, Shavin, they both agree, shemaschilin, that you could begin your meal. What? No context. Context-free statements. So how do we explain this? Says the Gemoro like this. That which we learned, that both agree that you're not allowed to start your meal after the ninth hour, mashkachasla, I can make it work out, the Eda Pesach and Eda Pesach. Because Eda Pesach, Rabbi Huna explained a few days ago that everybody agrees you don't start your meal. Okay, so that brisa which says that Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Yossi agree you don't start your meal is the context there is Eda Pesach. Okay, that's squared away. Alahod, the Tanya, but that which we learned, the other brisa. Shavin, Shemaschilin, everybody agrees you're allowed to start your meal. Emas, when is it? When does everybody agree you're allowed to start your meal? Rabbi Yossi says you're allowed to start your meal on a regular Shabbos and Yom Tov. But Rabbi Yehuda? So the brisa which said that they both agree that you shouldn't start your meal after the ninth hour, that's for Eda Pesach. As per our Mishnah, which singles out Eda Pesach, right? But the brisa which says everybody agrees that you don't start your meal, the brisa which says everybody agrees that you may start your meal, when does Rabbi Yehuda say you're allowed to start your meal? When is that? So I'm going to ask Amos, when is that? If you're going to suggest it's Erev Shabbos, they certainly disagree. Rabbi Yehuda's of the view you may not start your meal after the ninth hour on Erev Shabbos, so that can't be the case. So when exactly would Rabbi Yehuda agree that you may start a meal after the ninth? After the ninth hour. Says the Gemoro, like Kash, there's no dispute. Kan koidem tisha, kan la'achar tisha. When the Gemara says that everybody agrees you're allowed to start a meal, it's talking about before the ninth hour. And here's the source for the notion that even Rabbi Yehuda, which says you may not start a meal after the ninth hour, you may begin your meal before the ninth hour, even if it continues to after the ninth hour. But when it comes nightfall, you got to stop. This is the source for that idea. So we just added another piece to the picture. Right? What did we have so far till now? We had this idea that everybody agrees you may not start your meal on Erev Pesach. We had this idea that we follow Rabbi Yossi that you're allowed to keep on eating after the ninth hour. But now we're introducing a new idea, which is Rabbi Yehuda, which says you may not start your meal after the ninth hour ever, agrees that you're allowed to start before the ninth hour. And you don't have to stop just because the ninth hour arrived. But when nightfall arrives, that you do have to stop. Even though we don't follow that, except for Erev Pesach. On our Shabbos and Yom Tov, we would cover our bread and make Kiddush. Clear?
Prior to this point, we didn't know that.
Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to start before. Correct.
That you can start prior to the ninth hour.
And then keep on going. We knew that because Rashbam told us about this.
Everyone agreed.
That's right.
But this
is the affirmative. That's correct.
Statement that he doesn't.
But he does in fact agree that you can begin your meal before the ninth hour and you keep on going if the ninth hour hits. But when nightfall comes, you stop. Okay. Okay, we'll stop over here because on Monday we're going to be introduced to a new set of halachas, which is this unique custom that many have to make Kiddush in Shul Friday night with no meal that follows it.
Right.
With no meal that follows it. Chabad doesn't do it, and it's an anomaly. I'm not quite sure as to why Chabad doesn't do it, because as we're going to learn, the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch substantiates the custom and writes that it's He supports the idea of making Kiddush in shul. And many Ashkenazi communities believe they do that. Probably most. Do the Sephardic community do that also?
Yeah.
They also make Kiddush Friday night in shul? I don't know. But certainly the Ashkenazim do. And they have the rights to do it. I don't know why Chabad doesn't. I can't say. The Rebbe showed didn't happen, so I assume that it's a correct Chabad practice not to do it. But in Ashkenazi shuls, they certainly do it. Sorry?
How was that? Party shul?
They did or didn't?
No.
They did not do it.
Most Sephardic shuls don't do it.
I imagine because the Sephardim are consistent in avoiding making extra unnecessary brachas. Now, usually Chabad follows the Sephardim in that regard. But in the Shulchan Aruch, the Rebbe leans toward making Kiddush in shul Friday night. So that practice is going to be discussed in the Gemoro going forward, and then we'll learn out the Shulchan Aruch that discusses that set of laws, and that's going to introduce us to a whole new element of Kiddush, which is that when you make Kiddush, you have to be in the presence of your meal, which is related to what we're talking about, because we have this idea that a person shouldn't make the table shouldn't be brought until after he makes Kiddush. But if it's brought, cover the bread. But we have this other element that you have to make Kiddush in the place of your meal. So even if your table's not there yet, the table has to be brought to you. You shouldn't go to it because you have to make Kiddush in the place of your meal. And maybe your bread also has to be ready by the time. That's going to come up as well, because this Kiddush that's in shul, no one's eating anything.
Maybe that's why Rashi presumed that they were having a meal, because they were listening to Kiddush.
Okay, but you still have to substantiate the Brisa, which said, don't bring your table until you make Kiddush. You still have to deal with that, right? So that's going to open up a whole new section of understanding Kiddush, which is Kiddush b'makom suda. That your Kiddush has to be done in the place of your meal. Another section of halachas that's going to be introduced is this idea that when you make a bracha, any bracha on food, and then at some point you decide to switch location of where you're eating your meal,
Rabbi doesn't.
Okay, so in synagogue, the rabbi actually opens the door to the social hall, and he eats mazonos at his place to extend the meal. That's why he does that, by the way, for this reason, as we're going to learn. I'm talking about even during the weekday. You're eating a bagel, and you decide to eat the rest of the bagel in a different room. Should you make a new bracha when you move? That's also going to come up now, because the person made Kiddush in shul, he made hagafen. Should he be making hagafen again when he goes home? That person who led the Kiddush in shul. This is all going to come up next week, God willing. A wonderful day and a good night of Shabbos. Mazel for the bris downstairs, yeah.